I heard a little bit of a voice. Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. Perfect. Let me turn my camera on.
Bandwidth
All right,
issue.
Hopefully you can see me. Can you guys hear me and see me?
Yep.
All right. So first of all, it's nice to meet you, Dr. Heiser. I've been conversing with you over email for the last couple of months. We were supposed to have an interview like 2 months ago or something like that. And
Did
then
I
the
forget
next
about
month,
it?
I think you forgot about it. And then you emailed me and you said, "Do we have an interview today?" And I said, "We actually don't, but we can set something up." And so now we're here.
Okay.
But it's nice to meet you. I'm Wayne Philmore. And what my first question to you is actually, we discussed this over email. I wanted to talk about the significance of today being that the world as we know is supposed to end.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, we're still here. No, it's not going to. We actually just recorded a. I wonder if I haven't checked the email today, but I'm just wondering if it's up now. But we did a podcast episode yesterday on why the world didn't end on September 23rd. I don't think there's anything. Let not your heart be troubled. I don't think there's any basis for any of this thinking, both in terms of astronomy with the Nibiru Planet X stuff, or biblical thinking. And so that episode we went through why. We can get into that stuff if you want to, but no, I'm not expecting anything to happen today.
Well, thank God. Another question I do have for you is I'm familiar with your work from Unseen Realm, and is that the material where you basically make the notion, you say that as far as the other like ancient myths and stories about gods, there does seem to be some credibility towards their stories. I think you make that notion.
I use a lot of ancient Near Eastern material. I mean that topic specifically, really isn't like a focus point in the book, but I use ancient Near Eastern material all over the place in the book. Again, this isn't a terribly profound thought, but everybody in the ancient world, whether it's ancient Near East or somewhere else, they all have fundamental questions. It's a very human thing. How did I get here? What's the point? Is there something, other than me out there? They look at the stars and wonder about that. And, everybody has the same questions about, are there higher powers? Is there something, greater out there in terms of, intelligence and whatnot? So the ancient people aren't any different than now. They're wondering these questions, and they all have, again, some orientation about there's this world and there's the world of the gods, and what might that world be like? And again, they make some basic assumptions. I think that, hey, we don't like to live chaotic lives. We like when, we have enough to eat, when things are in order, and so on and so forth. So, gods are intelligent beings. They probably like that too. So we speak about the gods, and this includes scripture, we use these metaphors of family and counsel. And again, I think they're important, especially when they're mediated to us in scripture. I do think scripture is something, beyond, other ancient Near Eastern literature, but it's also part of the same, regional corpus, if you will, shared worldview, because God picked people to write. People live at certain times, places, they have certain cultures, and these are God's choices. So I expect similarity. I expect people to be asking the same sorts of questions. So in that sense, what ancient people are thinking about and expressing, you use the word validity. Okay, I don't accept all of their truth, or even most of their truth claims or truth propositions. And a lot of times they don't even lay them out. They just sort of assume things. But when it comes to, again, this impulse, this notion of a spiritual world and an ordered spiritual world, and that also means competition between the personalities, if you will. I think there's validity to that, because if we just take scripture off the board, for a moment are off the table. If we do have greater intelligences than us, it stands to reason that they wouldn't all agree, that there will be competition, that they will have a spectrum of relationships between each other. There will be competition for power and influence and so on and so forth. So in that sense, what the ancient Near Eastern person produces is pretty normal. It's expected. It's a manifestation of the things they're thinking about. And what they're thinking about isn't so strange. The way they express it might sound strange to our ear, but at the end of the day, they're asking the same questions as anybody else would.
That takes me into my next question I have for you. I think this would be my last one. I had a couple of months back, I had emailed you, and you probably may not remember this, but I had emailed you a quick explanatory, I guess you could say, model I had for the Nephilim. And at first I had certain views about the Nephilim, and what I tried to do is I tried to falsify those beliefs to the best of my abilities, and I actually did. So I think my belief was kind of more, you could say, fundamentalist, thinking about the Nephilim. They were 12 feet or 20 feet tall, they were really big, etc. And as I kept on digging and trying to find things that would falsify my beliefs on that, come to find out there were big people who lived 50,000 years ago, but they weren't 12 or 20 feet tall. They were 6 feet tall, and etc. And so my question is it more reasonable for Christians to just accept that the Nephilim story, it could have been true, but it was more, or at least exaggerated?
Well, I would say, well, if we go with the biblical description of Nephilim, and you actually get Goliath and one other that have any sort of height attribution, you're within the 6 to 8 foot range. In Goliath's case, you'd have to be reading the Dead Sea Scrolls to stay within that range. And I think, based upon, again, the scholarly comparisons of the Samuel texts in the Masoretic text and the Septuagint with the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think that is the proper reading. So that one little notation about cubits and spans with Goliath is part of a much wider net when it comes to the whole text critical issue of the books of Samuel. So I don't think that is an exaggeration. I mean, you would have had isolated people who, when you're living at a time when the average male height is about 5.5 feet tall, and you get somebody that's 7 feet tall, or pushing 8 feet, Manute Bol or something like that, somebody that's Yao Ming, really exceptionally tall. Well, I mean, the comparison would be so exaggerated that what else would you call that person? You might refer to them as a giant. You might, think that there's something going on there because it's so unusual. And ancient people oftentimes associated unusual attributes, with either a curse from the gods or a blessing from the gods or divine parentage or something like that. So what you actually see in the Bible is really not, I wouldn't use the word exaggeration. I think it's pretty normative. Again, you have these isolated individuals that are unusual. And if you get, if you get any sort of inbreeding, interbreeding or whatever, not in terms of a freakish, kind of thing, but, you marry up the traits, so to speak, you can get, people groups, families, that emerge that have, unusual height. So it's not really that abnormal. I think the better question, and maybe what you're actually asking, or what other people have been interacting with you about, is do we take a story like the Nephilim and do we interpret it literally, or do we interpret it mythically? And I think the mythic hermeneutic is something that's fundamentally misunderstood by Christians because of the way that a term like myth gets used. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yes.
Okay, I just lost the tab for a second there, but I think it gets fundamentally misused because when we hear the word myth, we think of fairy tales. In academic discourse, even though you might have writers that think of the term that way, mythic just means that you're dealing with a piece of literature in which God or divine beings are major characters in the story. That's a mythic story. So in that sense, the Bible is certainly mythic. But as Tolkien, I think it was Tolkien famously said, it's the myth that is true. When you have supernatural beings as foundational characters in a story, that's what it is literarily. And so you'd have to decide, okay, are the people of the day, are they looking at some of these unusual people, and they're making sort of mythic assumptions about them, that about their unusual physical features. So that's a question that some would have to deal with, and struggle with. But when you really think about it, we do mythic interpretation of our own lives every day. If I'm looking for a job, and I've been looking for a job for months, and I all of a sudden, I have a job now, and let me tell you the story. I was looking for months, and I went into the grocery store, and I bumped into this person, that I knew, and they happened to be with somebody else that they knew, and that person ran a business, and they were looking for somebody, to replace somebody that had just left, and we find out in conversation that our skill sets really overlapped, and this guy wound up hiring me. Look how the Lord was in that. Okay, what we've done is we've taken real circumstances in real life, and we've assigned by faith a spiritual meaning to that. We see God in the details. We see God in the events. That's mythic interpretation. That's all that is. And it doesn't mean it's false. I mean, if we believe that there's a God, if we believe there's a God who loves us and is an intelligent being, and again, all these things that collectively we look at as our Christian faith, which ultimately stem from the question I was asked early on, why are you a Christian? Again, because the alternative has less explanatory power, ultimately. And I would even add to that, because the Christian gospel is the only one that makes sense. Every other system has imperfect people trying to be perfect to please a perfect creator. It's just absurd. These works-based systems, these ritual-based systems, they're self-defeating across the board. So, you fit that story, me telling that story about how I got this job, and I see God in the details. Does that mean that it's just a product of my imagination? Well, no. How can we say that? If we believe that God is real, of course God was there. Maybe we didn't parse every part of the story correctly, but God was in there. Okay, I mean, he's in there, and he's doing things. He's influencing people. He's putting us in situations where, by providence, we take the left turn instead of the right turn, and we wind up with this or that outcome. So, should we approach Old Testament story that way? Should we approach other biblical story that way? Are the biblical writers seeing God in historical events? And then this is what comes out, again, under the providence of God. This is what they produce in writing. This is how they see God in the events. Well, you could certainly look at Scripture that way. It produces the question of, well, were the biblical writers right in every detail? Again, how would we know? We can say by faith that, okay, providence, says that, whatever they wrote, that turns out to be correct. Again, I'm not arguing for this view or against this view. I'm just saying this is a view that has a solid grounding in supernaturalism, and the reality of God, the reality of Christ, that we don't, we're not deists. God is active in our lives, and is this a filter through which we could understand Scripture? Well, maybe to me, there someone who would, and I